Really interesting situation. 80% of Americans did not want to get involved in World War II when the war started in 1939, and Hollywood was very concerned about the European market. They actually had viewing rooms for the Nazis where they would show their films, and if there was references to Jewish people that the Nazis didn't like, they would actually censor their own films. And then the situation dramatically changed with bombing of Pearl Harbor, where suddenly America said, oh, wait a minute, and there was an overwhelming interest and enthusiasm, patriotism for getting into the war. And so a number of Hollywood directors immediately offered their services. So people like Frank Capra, John Huston, John Ford, William Wyler, all very notable directors, and a number of Hollywood actors and other people all offered their services. And so the Hollywood was very much concerned about working with the government to produce films that would be patriotic, identify the fact that we were all in it together, and a number of these directors were actually making films for the government rather than just Hollywood films that were also very patriotic in nature.
Specifically, you mentioned Frank Capra, whom we all know as It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
He had already served in World War I. He was a veteran, and so he went and offered his services, and General Marshall said, I want you to make informational films, propaganda films, and Capra said, I've never made that kind of film before. And George Marshall says, I've never run a war like this before. And so what Capra did was he went and he looked at enemy propaganda to see what they were doing. He was particularly impressed with Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will. And he said, how can we compete against this? They're not worried about the truth. They have unlimited resources. And what he did then with the Why We Fight series, which was a series of films that were meant to educate the troops as to why we were fighting, because again, we had the situation where the majority of people did not want to get involved in the war, and then they had to be brought up to speed as to why we got in the war, why the enemy was bad, why we were good. And so Frank Capra made this series of educational and propaganda films, Why We Fight series, which were initially meant to educate the troops, but then were so effective that they were shown in theaters to the general public as well.
One of the more controversial films that Frank Capra made was The Negro Soldier.
Right.
Can you explain why it was both effective and controversial at the same time?
It wasn't, well, it would have been controversial at the time because it was singling out a group of people that were being, you know, the racism in the United States. The African American already was serving in World War I. And some fascinating stories about World War I veterans who were African American and dealing with prejudice, and how the many African Americans were actually honored in France, had a different attitude towards that particular group. So the fact that Frank Capra was singling these people out at a time when they were segregation was rampant in our country was considered controversial. Ironically, now the film is considered controversial because it's not dealing with all the horrible situations that were happening to, you know, the lynchings, the segregation. And so it was a film that needed to be made. It was one of those steps in the right direction.